Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. My guest is Nouriel Roubini, who is the chairman of Roubini Global Economics and professor of economics at Stern, NYU. Thank you very much for being with us.
Pleasure.
So the Eurozone leaders managed to pull it together and reached an agreement after 10 hours of discussion. Three falls, bank recapitalization, a revised EFSF, and 50% haircut on Greek debt held by private investors. What's your take on the agreement? Is the euro saved?
Well, my view is that the agreement is a positive step in the right direction. You needed a bigger haircut on the Greek debt. You needed to recapitalize the banks. You needed this big bazooka to prevent Italy and Spain's government spreads going through the roof. The question is whether it's sufficient to restore growth, sustainability, competitiveness in the Eurozone, and confidence. Certainly, that's key. My view is not going to be sufficient. The markets, of course, are rallying today because in order to have stability, you need to have growth and competitiveness. And nothing of what the Eurozone is doing right now restores growth and competitiveness. And unless you have economic growth and job growth, you'll have two problems. One is a backlash against austerity. People are not going to accept recession, depression for another 3-5 years until you restore growth. Two, you're trying to stabilize private and public debts and deficits as a share GDP. If your GDP keeps on falling, you look like unsustainable.
But what's the alternative, Nouriel Roubini, when the debt is that high to actually sustain growth? What's the alternative to austerity of some kind of expenses cut?
Well, the latest data from the Eurozone suggests that output is falling and they're going back into a recession, not just in the periphery, but even in the core of the Eurozone. If you have to restore growth and competitiveness, in my view, 3 or 4 policies are necessary now. First of all, the European Central Bank has to cut rates. They made a mistake raising them to try to boost economic growth, credit easing, quantitative easing, monetary easing. Secondly, the value of the euro is to fall sharply towards parity with the US dollar. Germany is uber competitive, can live with a euro at 140, 150, but the periphery needs a much weaker euro to restore competitiveness and their trade balances. 3, if the periphery is forced by the markets and by the IMF, EU, rightly, to do fiscal austerity, they have to tighten their belts. That's recession in short run, raising taxes, cutting spending. So the core of the Eurozone has to do fiscal stimulus to restore growth. Even the IMF, even Christine Lagarde has recently said, if everybody in the world is doing fiscal austerity front-loaded, that's going to be a disaster for the world. So if the periphery is doing austerity, the US, the UK, Japan, Germany, the core of the Eurozone has to do a stimulus. So you need monetary easing, you need a weaker euro, you need fiscal stimulus, you need to provide lend of last resort support to Italy, and you also have to reduce debts, not just of Greece, but also of other countries that are potentially not just illiquid, but also insolvent. If you do all these things, maybe you have a chance to restore growth and competitiveness and to rescue the Eurozone. If you don't have growth, eventually all financial engineering is not going to be sufficient.
So with also the 50% haircut on Greek debt for private investors, is there any contagion risk to other countries such as Italy?
There could be. Of course, people are going to say Greece was supposed to be unique and exceptional, but who's going to be next? Portugal looks like Greece. The public debt of Italy is 120% of GDP and rising. They don't have economic growth. There are even technical issues because of the way they do restructuring. The CDS protection of those who bought protection is not going to be triggered. So somebody's going to say, why should I buy Italian bonds, buy protection against them with CDS, and then if there is a credit event like a forced restructuring, technically is voluntary. There's nothing voluntary about shoving 50% haircut on the creditors and calling voluntary, and because of that technicality, CDS are not protecting me. So many people are going to ask, why should I buy Italian debt if 3 years from now I might have the same haircut,
so there is
and even the CDS doesn't protect me?
So there is a risk of contagion.
There's always a risk of contagion, of course.
What do you think of the extended EFSF? Will the Eurozone have a stronger capacity to react to the crisis?
I'm not sure if it's going to work. You know, people are going to say can this leveraged EFSF be truly AAA? Already the original EFSF was not really truly AAA because you take a bunch of non-AAA countries, you do bilateral guarantees, and you create something that looks like AAA. It looks like, to me like the CDOs of the subprime crisis where you pretended was AAA. And now you're doing a leverage EFSF. This is like a CDO of a CDO, a CDO squared. Why people are going to consider this one as AAA? There's a risk that France is going to lose its AAA status. Already these interest rates on the EFSF bonds are trading more like France rather than like German bonds that are AAA. So markets and investors are going to ask these tough questions, and that's how things could unravel.
Apparently, actually, the revised EFSF will allow China to step in and to invest in this special vehicle. What do you think of China intervening in this crisis, in this Eurozone crisis? Do you think they might be interested?
I'm not sure if they're going to be interested. First of all, nobody's doing anything for free. They're going to want something in exchange. They might ask Europe for this market status that they require. They want openness to investment. Two, the Chinese might not want to buy bonds that are risky, but they might say, you want my money, I'm willing to buy at a low price your real assets, like the ports or transportation, logistics in Greece, so that I have a beachhead for Europe, Central Europe, the Middle East, or other real assets. The Chinese are very pragmatic. They're not going to do anything as a favor to Europe. They're not likely to buy bonds that are risky. They want to buy real assets. And then the question is it politically acceptable that state-owned enterprises or sovereign funds that are government-owned in China are going to take over parts of European industry? Is it going to be acceptable? At which price? I think there are open questions about that.
Germany seems to be the current leader in the Eurozone today. Do you think that Berlin will impose its vision of Europe based on strict public finance? Angela Merkel spoke about sanctions in case a country did not respect the European Stability Pact.
The question is whether that's acceptable to the periphery. If you have a fiscal union in which essentially Germany decides what your taxes are, what your spending is, what your social security, social safety net is, because they want to make sure that there is not a moral hazard of this fiscal union becoming a transfer union, with, again, the same repeat of Greece happening, then is it politically acceptable for the periphery to give up altogether any fiscal autonomy and give essentially the keys of that fiscal autonomy on taxes and spending, and even on privatization to Germany? Is it feasible? And if it's not feasible, Germany might not want to do it. So people talk about a fiscal union, but I'm not sure if the political conditions for a fiscal union are going to materialize.
Do you think that France should go further in terms of reducing its deficits, and how Nicolas Sarkozy should he actually raise the VAT?
Well, it's clear that there is a large budget deficit and there are large stocks of public debt, even in France. It's clear that some of the rating agencies have already said there's a risk of a downgrade. If you do fiscal austerity too soon, cutting spending, raising taxes, VAT, the risk is that the recession becomes more likely, more severe. To me, the way to find a trade-off is I would commit today to actions that reduce your spending gradually over time, that raises tax gradually over time, rather than doing it all at the front. And if you credibly do so, and the market see light at the end of the tunnel, and you don't have a fiscal train wreck, if you need a little more of stimulus in the short run, or you postpone the austerity, they're not going to punish you. But more than the short run, they need a credible plan that there is a view that your fiscal situation is sustainable over time.
Raising the VAT might be a good idea in the short term?
Well, you have to decide how much of that gives you fiscal credibility you need on one side, as opposed to making then the disposable income of households already weaker and making the risk of a recession even greater. I think
they need 5 billion, between 5 and 10 billions, really quickly, relatively quickly.
Well, there is a whole spectrum of policy actions. It's not up to me to decide for a country which spending cuts, which tax increases are necessary. Probably signaling you're going to do something on the fiscal side is necessary. There's always a risk that you do fiscal austerity, then your recession gets worse, then you don't achieve your target, then you have to do more fiscal austerity. It's a bit the trap that Greece has fallen into. So I'm more in favor of stuff that more credibly resolve your fiscal issues over the medium term and minimize the kind of things that imply a fiscal drag and a threat to growth in the short run, because you have to trade off the medium term with the need to do less of a stimulus, less of a drag, and more of a stimulus in the short run.
The US economy probably grew in the third quarter at the fastest pace this year. Gross domestic product rose at a 2.5%. What's your take on this? Is there a recovery?
I don't buy it. Usually the first estimate of growth tend to be revised downwards because the first estimate are large, based on large corporation and large retailers like Walmart. So the big corporates are doing well, but the small, medium-sized enterprises are shrinking or disappearing. The big retailers like Walmart, McDonald's doing well. Hundreds of thousands of mom-and-pop stores are disappearing. So when they revise the data, like the first quarter estimates was originally 1.5%, revised to 0.4%. So the U.S. economy, I see, is not growing at 2.5%. I think the number is more like 1.5%. Unemployment is 9.1%, including discouraged workers and partially employed workers already 16.5%, including all the people that are in jail is like 20%, and among young, poor, minorities between 25 to 30%, and half of all these unemployed people are long-term unemployed. U.S. has a growth and a jobs and unemployment problem as severe now as Europe.
Well, thank you very much, Nouriel Roubini, and thanks to you. Stay with us on France 24.